In 1890, at the Blackwood Children's Home in Manchester, England, a photograph was taken during an official inspection visit by the city's Board of Guardians, the government body responsible for overseeing workhouses and orphanages. The photograph shows a young boy, approximately 8 years old, wearing a clean white shirt, standing beside the orphanage matron, Mrs. Eleanor Hartley. The boy appears to be smiling shyly, his right hand raised to his face in what looks like an endearing gesture of bashfulness, as if trying to hide a grin while being photographed. The matron's hand rests on his shoulder in what seems to be a protective, reassuring way. For over 130 years, this photograph was preserved in Manchester's municipal archives as evidence of proper institutional care, a heartwarming image proving that orphaned children were well treated, healthy, and even happy under the workhouse system. But in 2024, when this photograph was submitted for professional digital restoration as part of a research project on Victorian child welfare, specialists discovered something in the enhanced image that transformed this seemingly innocent portrait into something deeply disturbing and tragic. The restoration revealed details that had been invisible for over a century, details that exposed what the boy's raised hand was really hiding, what his smile actually represented, and why the matron's grip on his shoulder was so firm. What appeared to be childhood shyness was actually something far darker, and this photograph, taken to demonstrate good care, accidentally preserved evidence of systematic cruelty that authorities were desperately trying to hide. Subscribe now. Because this photograph tells a story about the brutal reality of Victorian orphanages, about children who suffered in silence, and about how one moment of truth was captured despite every attempt to stage a lie. The photograph arrived at the University of Manchester's Centre for Social History in February 2024 as part of a collection of Victorian workhouse records donated by Manchester City Council. Among thousands of documents, admission registers, punishment logs, death certificates, inspection reports, this particular photograph immediately caught researchers' attention for what initially seemed like positive reasons. The image showed what appeared to be an exemplary scene of Victorian child welfare. The setting looked surprisingly pleasant for an institution. Clean, whitewashed walls, a large window allowing natural light, wooden flooring that appeared swept and maintained. A small wooden chair was visible in the background, and the overall impression was one of order and cleanliness. The boy in the photograph appeared to be approximately 8 years old, with light brown hair neatly combed and parted to one side. He wore a white cotton shirt that looked clean and in good condition, remarkably so, considering that most Victorian orphanage photographs showed children in threadbare, stained, or ill-fitting clothing. His dark trousers appeared properly sized and relatively new. His face looked clean. His visible hand appeared washed. His fingernails looked trimmed. Standing beside him was a woman identified in records as Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, the senior matron at Blackwood Children's Home. She appeared to be in her late 40s or early 50s, wearing the formal black dress and white apron that were the uniform of Victorian institutional supervisors. Her hair was pulled back severely in a tight bun. Her posture was rigid and upright, her expression stern but not obviously cruel. She had the professional, authoritative look expected of someone in her position. Her right hand rested on the boy's left shoulder, a gesture that looked supervisory and even somewhat protective, as if she was presenting the child for the photograph while ensuring he stood properly still. But it was the boy's expression and gesture that made the photograph seem particularly charming and memorable. The boy appeared to be smiling. His mouth was turned slightly upward at the corners, and there was what looked like a brightness or liveliness to his face. His right hand was raised to his face, with his fingers touching his right cheek and partially covering the right side of his mouth. a gesture that looked exactly like the bashful shyness of a child being photographed, trying to hide an embarrassed grin. Anyone who has photographed children would recognize this gesture immediately. The endearing way young children cover their faces when they're feeling self-conscious about smiling, or when they're told to look at the camera and suddenly become shy. It was a gesture that made the boy seem real, human, childlike, not the usual rigid, frightened appearance of children in Victorian institutional photographs. On the back of the photograph, written in formal handwriting, Blackwood Children's Home, Manchester. Board of Guardians Inspection, April 17, 1890. Child, Samuel T., age 8. Conditions satisfactory. Children well fed and supervised. Dr. Catherine Morrison, the social historian leading the Victorian Child Welfare Research Project, made her initial assessment in the digital catalogue. Exceptional example of positive Victorian orphanage conditions. Unusual photograph for this era. Child appears genuinely happy, displaying natural childhood behavior. Clean clothing, good physical condition, appropriate supervision. Very useful for exhibition on Victorian child welfare improvements. Notable that child is smiling, extraordinarily rare in institutional photographs of this period, suggesting unusually good conditions at this facility. The photograph was scheduled for high-priority restoration, with plans to feature it prominently in an upcoming exhibition about the evolution of child welfare in Victorian England. It seemed to offer a counterpoint to the usual narrative of Victorian orphanage cruelty, evidence that not all institutions were brutal, that some children were actually cared for properly. But Dr. Morrison had worked with enough Victorian photographs to know that things are not always what they seem, and that the Victorians were masters of presenting false facades. She requested that the restoration specialist examine the photograph with particular attention to details that might be hidden by age and fading, especially around the boy's face and the matron's hand position. I've learned to be suspicious of any Victorian institutional photograph that looks too good to be true, Dr. Morrison noted in her research log, especially photographs taken during official inspections. Dr. James Fletcher, the digital restoration specialist, began his careful work on the Blackwood Children's Home photograph. As he enhanced the image using modern software that could recover details lost to more than 130 years of fading and degradation, he started to notice things that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The first thing that struck Dr. Fletcher as he worked was the contrast between the boy's apparent smile and his eyes. When he enhanced the facial details, recovering subtle gradations of light and shadow that had become nearly invisible in the aged photograph, the boy's eyes told a completely different story from his mouth. The eyes were not smiling. They were wide, perhaps too wide, with an expression that looked more like fear or pain than happiness. There was a tightness around the eyes, visible even in the low resolution of Victorian photography, that suggested tension rather than joy. The brightness that had seemed like cheerful liveliness in the original image appeared, in the enhanced version, to look more like the glistening of held-back tears. When Dr. Fletcher enhanced the boy's raised hand and the right side of his face that the hand was covering, more disturbing details began to emerge. The hand's position was odd. It wasn't just resting gently against the cheek in a shy gesture. The fingers appeared to be pressed firmly against the face, as if deliberately covering something specific. The positioning looked intentional and careful, not natural or casual. The fingers were spread in a way that suggested they were trying to cover as much area as possible. And beneath the fingers, barely visible even in the enhanced image, there appeared to be some kind of discoloration on the boy's cheek, darker areas that could be shadows from the hand, or could be something else. Dr. Fletcher couldn't be certain yet, but his years of experience with historical photographs told him to look more closely. He then turned his attention to the boy's posture and stance. Enhanced, the body language looked wrong. The boy was standing rigidly straight, almost unnaturally so, as if standing at attention or trying very hard to maintain a specific position. His left shoulder, where the matron's hand rested, appeared to be slightly hunched or raised, as if tensed or reacting to pressure. Most tellingly, when Dr. Fletcher examined the boy's visible left hand hanging at his side, the hand was clenched into a tight fist. The knuckles showed white even in the black and white photograph, suggesting extreme tension. This was not the relaxed hand of a happy child being photographed. This was the clenched fist of someone in distress, trying to maintain control. Dr. Fletcher then enhanced the matron's hand on the boy's shoulder. What he saw made him pause and increase the magnification further. The matron's hand was not resting gently on the shoulder. It was gripping it. The fingers appeared to be dug into the boy's shoulder with considerable force. The fabric of the boy's shirt showed indentations where the fingers pressed. The thumb, visible on the front of the shoulder, appeared to be pressing hard enough to create a visible depression in the flesh beneath the thin cotton shirt. This was not a protective or reassuring touch. This was physical restraint. The matron was holding the boy in place, gripping him firmly to keep him from moving or changing position. When Dr. Fletcher enhanced the matron's face, her expression also looked different from the initial impression. The stern but professional look appeared, in the enhanced image, to have an edge of something else, perhaps tension, perhaps anger barely controlled, perhaps warning. Her eyes were looking slightly downward, toward the boy, and the gaze had a quality that suggested she was watching him very carefully, monitoring his behavior, ready to react if he did something wrong. Dr. Fletcher sat back from his screen, feeling deeply troubled. He had restored hundreds of Victorian photographs, including many from institutions, and he had learned to recognize the signs of what he privately called staged photographs, images carefully composed to hide unpleasant realities. He called Dr. Morrison immediately. "I think you need to see the enhanced images," he said, "and I think you need to tell me what you know about Blackwood Children's Home, because I don't think this boy is smiling at all. I think he's in pain, and I think he's covering something on his face that someone didn't want the inspectors to see." Dr. Morrison immediately began researching Blackwood Children's Home and the context of Victorian institutional childcare. What she discovered painted a picture far darker than the photograph suggested. Blackwood Children's Home was not technically an orphanage. It was a child pauper ward attached to the Manchester Union Workhouse, part of the poor law system that was supposed to provide care for destitute children. In reality, workhouse children's wards in Victorian England were often places of systematic neglect, abuse, and cruelty. The historical record was damning. Victorian orphanages and workhouses operated under what was called the principle of less eligibility, the idea that conditions inside these institutions should be worse than the worst conditions outside, to discourage people from seeking public assistance. This principle, meant to apply to adults, was also applied to children who had committed no crime except being born into poverty or losing their parents. Children in workhouses like Blackwood were subjected to brutal discipline regimes. Physical punishment was not just permitted, it was considered necessary and proper. The disciplinary measures officially recorded included beatings with leather straps, caning, being locked in dark cellars for hours or days, having food withheld as punishment, being forced to stand in painful positions for extended periods, and being subjected to public humiliation as warnings to other children. Dr. Morrison found records from the 1880s and 1890s showing that Blackwood specifically had been investigated multiple times for excessive discipline, following complaints from visiting clergy and local citizens who witnessed children with visible injuries. However, these investigations rarely resulted in meaningful changes because corporal punishment of difficult or disobedient workhouse children was considered entirely legal and appropriate by Victorian standards. Most significantly, Dr. Morrison discovered documentation about a specific practice related to official inspections. Victorian workhouses were required by law to undergo periodic inspections by boards of guardians, the local government bodies responsible for administering the poor law system. These inspections were supposed to ensure that institutions were meeting minimum standards of care. In reality, workhouse administrators knew when inspections were scheduled and would extensively prepare for them. Children would be scrubbed clean, dressed in the best clothing available, often borrowed from other institutions or purchased specifically for inspection days. And the most presentable children would be selected to be photographed or to interact with inspectors. More disturbingly, internal records and later testimony from former workhouse children revealed that children would be threatened with severe punishments if they said or did anything during inspections that might reflect badly on the institution. They were coached on what to say, how to behave, and warned that if they complained to inspectors, they would be brutally punished afterward. Some institutions went further. Children with visible signs of recent punishment, bruises, welts, cuts, would be hidden away during inspections, kept in back rooms or cellars until the inspectors left. But if a child had to be presented during an inspection, despite having visible injuries, various strategies were used to hide the evidence. Strategic clothing that covered marks, careful positioning for photographs to hide injured areas, or simply instructing the child to cover any visible marks themselves. Dr. Morrison found a particularly chilling document. Internal correspondence from the Manchester Board of Guardians dated 1891, just 1 year after the photograph in question, specifically criticizing Blackwood Children's Home for staging misleading photographs during inspections, and warning that the practice of presenting children in false conditions must cease. The record also contained testimony from a former Blackwood resident, taken in 1895 during a formal inquiry. Before inspection days, they would beat us worse than usual, then tell us to smile and look happy when the gentleman came, or we'd get another beating twice as bad. They would put clean shirts on us just for the photographs, then take them away after. If we had marks on our faces from beatings, they'd tell us to cover them with our hands and pretend to be shy. Research into official mortality records revealed that Blackwood Children's Home had a child death rate of approximately 25% for children under age 10, meaning 1 in 4 children admitted to the institution died there, primarily from diseases exacerbated by malnutrition, neglect, and overcrowding, but also from injuries sustained from disciplinary measures. The photograph of the smiling boy had been taken on April 17, 1890, an officially scheduled Board of Guardians inspection day. The photograph was clearly not a spontaneous image, but a carefully staged piece of documentary evidence meant to demonstrate satisfactory conditions to government inspectors. And the boy identified on the back as Samuel T., age 8, appeared in admission records. Samuel Thomas Walker, admitted to Blackwood Children's Home in November 1888 at age 6, after both parents died of typhoid fever. He would have been at the institution for approximately 17 months when this photograph was taken. As Dr. Fletcher continued the restoration process, using increasingly sophisticated enhancement techniques, the disturbing reality hidden in the photograph became undeniable. Working at extreme magnification on the boy's face, Dr. Fletcher was able to recover details that had been completely invisible in the faded original. What he discovered confirmed the worst suspicions. Beneath the boy's raised hand, on his right cheek, there was clear evidence of a dark bruise, a contusion approximately 2 inches in diameter, centered on the cheekbone. The discoloration was distinctive and unmistakable in the enhanced image, darker at the center, spreading outward, with the irregular edges characteristic of impact bruising. The bruise appeared to be relatively recent, perhaps 2 to 3 days old, in the yellowish-purple stage of healing. The boy's hand was positioned precisely to cover this bruise as completely as possible. The fingers were spread carefully to maximize coverage, and the hand was pressed firmly against the face to ensure no gaps that might reveal the injury to the camera. When Dr. Fletcher enhanced the left side of the boy's face, the side not covered by his hand, additional evidence emerged. There appeared to be a faint linear mark running from the corner of his mouth toward his ear, a thin line that looked consistent with a strike from a cane or strap. There was also slight swelling visible around his left eye, barely detectable but present in the enhanced image, suggesting that the eye had been struck or had suffered impact trauma. Most heartbreakingly, when Dr. Fletcher achieved maximum enhancement on the boy's mouth, what had appeared to be a smile revealed itself as something else entirely. The corners of the mouth were indeed turned upward, but the expression appeared forced and unnatural. The lips were pressed together tightly, and the overall facial muscle pattern suggested effort rather than genuine happiness. The boy appeared to be deliberately stretching his mouth into a smile-like shape, following instructions to look happy, despite being in pain or distress. The enhanced image of his eyes confirmed this interpretation. The eyes showed visible moisture, tears being held back. The eyebrows were slightly raised and drawn together in an expression that typically indicates pain, fear, or distress. The pupils appeared dilated, another physiological sign of stress or fear. Dr. Fletcher then examined the matron's grip on the boy's shoulder at maximum magnification. The evidence was clear. Mrs. Hartley's fingers were dug deeply into the boy's shoulder, creating visible indentations in both the fabric and the flesh beneath. The thumb, positioned on the front of the shoulder, appeared to be pressing directly onto what looked like another bruise. Darker discoloration, visible even through the thin cotton shirt. The boy's hunched shoulder and raised tension on that side made perfect sense now. The matron was gripping an existing injury, causing additional pain, likely as a form of control and silent threat. The message was clear. Stand still, smile, do as you're told, or I will hurt you more. When Dr. Fletcher enhanced the background of the photograph, looking for any details that might provide additional context, he found something that had been nearly invisible in the original, partially visible through the window behind the subjects, appearing as dark shapes that only became identifiable in the enhanced image, were what appeared to be 2 other children's faces, indistinct, but definitely there, pressed against the window glass, watching the photograph being taken. These children were not in the carefully staged photograph. They were not dressed in clean white shirts. They appeared to be watching from outside the room, excluded from the performance being created for the inspectors. Their presence accidentally captured in the background, barely visible in the original photograph and easily overlooked, but undeniably there in the enhanced restoration. Finally, Dr. Fletcher examined the floor area around the subjects. The enhanced image revealed something odd. What appeared to be small, dark spots on the wooden floor near the boy's feet. The spots had the irregular shape and distribution pattern of dried blood drops, consistent with recent bleeding that had been hastily wiped but not thoroughly cleaned. The complete enhanced photograph told a horrifying story. A boy who had been beaten, probably the day before or the morning of the inspection, was forced to stand for an official photograph meant to demonstrate good institutional care. He was told to smile and to cover his injuries. He was gripped painfully by a matron who was simultaneously presenting him as evidence of proper care while inflicting additional pain to ensure his compliance. Other children, probably bearing similar injuries, were hidden away during the inspection, and the whole scene was carefully staged to create false documentation that would satisfy government inspectors and allow the abuse to continue. With the restored photograph clearly showing evidence of abuse, Dr. Morrison intensified her research into Samuel Thomas Walker specifically, and into what happened at Blackwood Children's Home after this photograph was taken. What she discovered was both tragic and, in some ways, ultimately hopeful. Samuel Thomas Walker was admitted to Blackwood Children's Home on November 3, 1888, at age 6 years and 2 months. His parents, Thomas and Mary Walker, had both died of typhoid fever within days of each other, leaving Samuel and 2 younger siblings orphaned. The siblings were separated, a common practice, with Samuel sent to Blackwood, his 4-year-old sister sent to a different institution, and his 2-year-old brother placed in a baby farm, a form of informal adoption, often exploitative. Records show that Samuel was classified as a difficult child from the beginning. Reports by Mrs. Hartley and other staff described him as willful, disobedient, and resistant to correction. Victorian institutional thinking interpreted any resistance from children, even natural grief reactions or age-appropriate behavior, as moral deficiency requiring harsh correction. Punishment records, which institutions were required to keep, though they often underreported, showed that Samuel was subjected to disciplinary measures at least once per week during his time at Blackwood. The punishments recorded included caning, at least 15 documented instances, being locked in the dark cellar, 10 instances, food deprivation, numerous instances, and being forced to stand holding heavy stones for extended periods, 7 instances. The April 17, 1890 inspection was a crucial one for Blackwood. The institution had been under increased scrutiny following complaints, and the inspection was specifically ordered to assess whether the home was meeting basic standards of care. The photograph of Samuel was taken specifically for the inspection report. Documentation to show government officials that children at Blackwood were healthy and well treated. The inspection report, dated April 20, 1890, concluded that Blackwood Children's Home maintains satisfactory standards of cleanliness, nutrition, and discipline. Children observed appeared healthy and appropriately supervised. Recommend continued funding. The photograph of Samuel smiling while covering his bruised face was included in the official report as evidence. But the story doesn't end there. In August 1890, just 4 months after this photograph was taken, a scandal erupted at Blackwood Children's Home. A local physician, Dr. Robert Hughes, who had been called to treat a child with a severe infection, became suspicious about the number and nature of injuries he observed. He made a confidential report to the Manchester Board of Guardians, providing detailed documentation of suspected abuse. A surprise inspection was conducted, unannounced, unlike the April inspection, and the real conditions at Blackwood were discovered. Inspectors found children with untreated injuries, evidence of systematic beatings, malnutrition, and deplorable living conditions hidden behind the carefully maintained facade shown during scheduled inspections. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley was immediately dismissed and actually faced criminal charges for assault, highly unusual for the Victorian era when corporal punishment of institutional children was generally considered acceptable. She was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in prison, though she served only 3 months before being released. Blackwood Children's Home was placed under direct municipal management. The existing staff was replaced, and reforms were implemented. While conditions remained far from ideal by modern standards, the systematic abuse ended. And Samuel? Records show that after the August 1890 investigation, Samuel was transferred to a different institution with reportedly better conditions. In 1892, at age 10, he was apprenticed to a Manchester textile mill, a common path out of the workhouse system for older children. Census records show that Samuel Walker survived to adulthood, no small achievement given the mortality rates at places like Blackwood. He appears in the 1901 census as a 19-year-old textile worker, living in independent lodgings in Manchester. He later married, had 3 children of his own, and lived until 1954, dying at age 72. One remarkable piece of evidence survives. A brief oral history interview conducted with Samuel Walker in 1948, when he was 66 years old, as part of a project documenting working-class life in Victorian Manchester. In the interview, Samuel briefly mentioned his time at Blackwood. They wanted us to look happy for the photographs when the gentlemen came to inspect. We weren't happy. We were terrified. They'd beat us, then tell us to smile and pretend everything was wonderful, or they'd beat us worse. I remember standing there with my hand on my face, covering where she'd hit me, trying to smile like they told me, thinking if I didn't smile right, what would happen to me after the inspectors left. That photograph, someone showed it to me once years ago. People thought it showed a happy little boy. It showed a little boy who'd learned that showing the truth got you hurt. The restored photograph of Samuel Walker is now displayed at the Museum of Social History in Manchester, with a detailed caption explaining what the image actually shows. The museum uses it as part of an exhibition on child welfare reform, demonstrating how Victorian institutions staged false evidence of good care while systematic abuse continued behind closed doors. Dr. Morrison notes that photographs like Samuel's are valuable precisely because they accidentally preserved evidence that was meant to be hidden. The Victorians tried to use photography to create a false record, to document lies about how they treated vulnerable children. But photography is too honest. It captures everything, even things the photographer didn't want to show. This photograph was meant to hide the truth, but modern technology has allowed us to recover that truth and finally tell Samuel's real story. The image has become an important historical document used by researchers studying Victorian child welfare, the history of institutional abuse, and the ways that authorities have historically attempted to conceal mistreatment of children in their care. For over 130 years, people looking at this photograph saw a sweet image of a shy boy smiling during an inspection at his orphanage. Now we see the truth. A traumatized child forced to hide his injuries and pretend to be happy while his abuser literally had him in her grip. Not a sweet portrait, but evidence of cruelty. And ultimately, evidence that led to reform and accountability. Samuel Walker survived his Victorian childhood. He lived a long life. He had children and grandchildren who grew up free from the institutional abuse he endured. His photograph, meant to hide the truth, became the proof that exposed it.